In the summer of 210 BCE, somewhere in the plains of Hebei, the most powerful ruler the world had ever seen was traveling in his imperial carriage. His servants were still bringing meals to the carriage door. His guards were still riding in formation. His officials were still issuing decrees in his name. The emperor had been dead for 2 weeks. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, had died at a provincial relay station called Shaqiu. The 2 men who discovered the body, a palace eunuch named Zhao Gao and the chief minister of the empire, Lai Si, decided immediately to tell no one. They placed cartloads of salted fish near the imperial carriage. They allowed the convoy to move forward as though nothing had changed. Meals were brought to the carriage and taken away uneaten. Decrees went out as normal. The ruse held for roughly 2 months. By the time the convoy reached the capital at Xianyang, Zhao Gao had already forged the succession. He had already sent a false imperial decree to the crown prince, the capable and widely respected Fusu, ordering him to commit suicide for crimes he had not committed. He had already selected a replacement emperor, the emperor's 18th son, a young man known for his complete dependence on Zhao Gao's guidance. The young man had no administrative experience, no political standing, and no independent judgment. That was the point. What happened next in the 15 months that followed dismantled the most powerful administrative state in the ancient world, not in a generation, not gradually, in 15 months. The Qin dynasty had conquered all of China in 9 years. It administered China for 15 years. It collapsed in 15 months. The paradox at the center of this story is that the same system that made the conquest possible made the governance impossible. The same discipline that produced the unbeatable army produced the resentment. The same administrative genius that standardized a shattered civilization produced the conditions for its own destruction. But to understand how that happened, we need to start 2 centuries earlier, with a minor state in the northwest corner of the Chinese world that had nothing except a willingness to try something no one else was willing to try. In 475 BCE, China was at war. Not the normal war of the Zhou period, ceremonial chariot battles where aristocrats fought aristocrats by agreed-upon rules, where you didn't attack during funerals, where enemies were released for ransom. That world had already been ending for a century. What replaced it was something new and brutal, total war. States that mobilized entire peasant populations as infantry, armies of hundreds of thousands, battles where the defeated didn't go home. The Zhou dynasty had given way to something that had no precedent in Chinese history. By the time this period, known as the Warring States era, reached its final phase, 7 major powers had emerged from the wreckage of the old order: Han, Wei, Zhao, Yan, Kai, Chu, and in the northwest, occupying the Wei River Valley behind the natural barrier of the Qinling Mountains and the Hangu Pass, the state of Qin. Qin was not the obvious candidate. It occupied a geographic frontier that more sophisticated states in the east considered semi-barbarous. Its agricultural heartland was productive, but its position was peripheral. For decades it was a minor player. Then, in 361 BCE, a man arrived from the state of Wei. His name was Xianyang, and he had a proposal that would transform the Qin state into a machine, unlike anything the ancient world had produced. Xianyang belonged to a school of thought that had no patience for the Confucian belief in moral cultivation, ritual propriety, and educated gentlemen advising kings. The legalists argued something simpler and bleaker. Human beings are self-interested by nature. They respond to incentives and punishments. If you want a powerful state, design those incentives and punishments correctly, enforce them impartially and publicly, and the state will produce what you need. What the Qin needed, Duke Xiao of Qin agreed, was military power. Xianyang's reforms were implemented in 2 waves over roughly 2 decades. They remade Qin from the ground up. First, the military merit system. Hereditary aristocratic rank was abolished as a basis for military command and land allocation. Rank and land were now awarded strictly on battlefield performance, measured by enemy heads taken in combat. 20 military ranks created a ladder from common peasant to noble, climbed entirely by killing. This transformed the Qin army from a feudal force of aristocrats with obligations into a professional infantry that fought for personal advancement. The Qin soldier had a reason to win that no other army soldier had. Second, administrative reorganization. The state was divided into counties governed by centrally appointed officials rather than hereditary lords. Population was registered. Mutual surveillance household groups were created, where each group was collectively punished if any member committed a crime. The state now reached directly into the village, bypassing the aristocratic intermediaries that every other state depended on. Third, agricultural standardization. Idle persons, vagrants, unlicensed merchants, those who neglected farming were conscripted into hard labor. The agricultural base of the state was organized as a direct resource of the central government. Fourth, legal codification. Written, public law replaced aristocratic custom. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone knew the punishment. The law was not a judgment made by a superior. It was a mechanism that ran impartially on everyone equally. The reforms worked. Qin's military power grew steadily. Xianyang himself was eventually executed after his patron Duke Xiao died. He had made too many enemies among the aristocracy he had demoted. But his reforms survived him, embedded in the Qin state as its operating system. He had built a machine that outlasted him. Here is what the legalist machine did well. It mobilized resources. It produced soldiers who fought effectively. It eliminated the corruption and favoritism that plagued other states' military and administrative systems. It gave the Qin state a coherence and discipline that its enemies could not match. Here is what it could not do. It could not generate loyalty. It could not generate the belief among the people it governed that their ruler deserved to rule. It could not produce the moral legitimacy that the Confucian tradition called the mandate of heaven, the idea that a ruler governed because heaven endorsed the quality of his governance. The Qin never cared about this. For 130 years of warring states' competition, they didn't need to. In conquest, the legalist machine was without equal. The question that would destroy the empire was, what happens when the conquest ends? In 221 BCE, the question became urgent. A young man named Xianyang, who had become king of Qin at the age of 13, who had spent his teenage years navigating court intrigues, who had personally suppressed 2 coup attempts by the time he was 22, who had then spent 10 years conducting 9 campaigns that consumed the final 6 remaining independent states of China, sat in his court at Xianyang and asked his ministers what title to give himself. King was inadequate. He had surpassed every king who had ever existed in Chinese history. He had done what no one had ever done. His ministers proposed combining the terms for the mythological sage rulers of Chinese legend, the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors, into a single compound, Huangdi, August Emperor. Xianyang took the title and added one word, Shi. First, he would be the first August Emperor, and the dynasty would continue, he declared, for 10,000 generations, numbered 2nd Emperor, 3rd Emperor forever. The title Huangdi, created in this moment, would be used by Chinese rulers for the next 133 years, until 1912. What Qin Shi Huang then proceeded to do with his empire was extraordinary. He reorganized it. Where the Zhou dynasty had governed through a feudal network of lords who owed ritual allegiance to the king, the Qin abolished feudalism entirely. The conquered territories were divided into 36 commanderies, each governed by 3 officials, a civil governor, a military commander, and a supervisor who monitored the other 2. All 3 reported to Xianyang. None held hereditary claims. This was the first centralized bureaucratic state in Chinese history, and every subsequent Chinese dynasty would follow its model. He standardized it. The 6 conquered states had spent 2 centuries developing their own currencies, their own measurement systems, their own written scripts. The Qin mandated one currency, the round bronze coin with the square hole, one system of weights and measures, with standardized vessels distributed to every official post in the empire, one standard axle width for carts so that roads could carry any vehicle, and one written script, the small seal script, which replaced the divergent regional variants that had evolved across the 7 states. That last standardization, the written script, is perhaps the most consequential decision in Chinese history. China would fraction it over the following millennia into dozens of mutually unintelligible spoken dialects, but the written script never fractured. The character for sun was read differently in Guangzhou and Beijing, but it was the same character. The Qin standardization of writing meant that a literate Chinese person could communicate across the entire empire through text, even when speech was useless. This persisted. The Chinese script in use today traces its lineage directly to that decision made in 221 BCE. He built. The Qin road network radiated from Xianyang. A major arterial road, the Straight Road, ran 700 kilometers north toward the Ordos Loop to enable rapid military movement against nomadic incursions. A canal in the deep south, the Link Canal, linked two river systems and enabled military supply to the southern campaigns. The first sections of what would eventually become the Great Wall were ordered connected and extended under the command of General Meng Tian, who reportedly commanded 300,000 soldiers and conscripted laborers along its length. And he toured 5 inspection tours of the empire in the last decade of his life, performing sacrifices at the sacred mountains, erecting stone steels with inscribed proclamations of his achievements. 7 of those steels survive, and the writing is remarkable, not propaganda of the conventional kind, but a genuine articulation of what the unification had meant. The text on the Mount Stele reads, in part, "The august emperor in person brings all under heaven under one rule. Tirelessly he takes charge of affairs, morning to night never resting." He was not lying about the tirelessness. By every ancient account, Qin Shi Huang was a man of extraordinary energy and administrative capacity. He reportedly read 120 pounds of documents, written on bamboo strips, the medium of his era, every day. But alongside, the energy was a deepening obsession that would shape the final decade of his reign. He was terrified of dying. He could not hear the words death or dying in his presence. He slept in a different palace each night, with death penalty for anyone who disclosed his location. He believed that demons that could not find him could not kill him. He sent a court scholar named Zhu Fu on an expedition across the Eastern Sea to find the islands where immortality herbs reportedly grew, funding a fleet of ships and thousands of young men and women to sail beyond the horizon. Zhu Fu never returned. A second expedition was funded. It also failed. Alchemists at court prescribed medicines containing cinnabar, a compound of mercury, as longevity aids. Modern soil surveys of Qin Shi Huang's unexcavated burial mound near Xian have found mercury levels approximately 100 times higher than the surrounding earth. The ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing inside the tomb. Whether the emperor spent his final years slowly poisoning himself with the substance he believed would give him immortality is a question archaeology cannot yet definitively answer. But the profile of his behavior in the last years, increasing irrationality, reclusive paranoia, the compulsive search for immortality, is consistent with what chronic mercury poisoning does to the human mind. He was 49 when he died at Shaqiu. The man who wanted to reign for 10,000 generations managed 15. The seeds of the Qin dynasty's illegitimacy were planted while it was still at its height. In 213 BCE, at a court banquet, a minister named Chunyu Yu made a suggestion. He proposed that the emperor should follow Zhu precedent and enfeoff his sons as kings over the conquered territories, to provide stability in case of crises in distant parts of the empire. It was a reasonable proposal. It was what the Zhu had done. Lai Si, the chief minister, argued against it with characteristic sharpness. The reason the Zhu had fallen, he said, was precisely this feudal fragmentation. Enfeoffed sons become independent lords. Independent lords accumulate power. The lesson of history was that feudalism ended in civil war. The Qin's model, direct central control, was superior precisely because it eliminated that possibility. Lai Si then proposed something that went considerably further, that private possession of classical texts, the Confucian canonical books of history, poetry, and philosophy, be prohibited outside official state archives. He argued that scholars were using the past to criticize the present, comparing the current administration unfavorably to the Zhou kings. This was not scholarship. It was subversion. Qin Shi Huang agreed. The decree that followed gave private owners 30 days to surrender prohibited texts to officials for burning. Books on medicine, agriculture, divination, and the Qin's own historical records were exempted. The classical Confucian tradition, the text that trained the scholar official class, was to be destroyed outside the imperial archives. The following year, Qin Shi Huang's patience with the scholarly class broke entirely. Two court scholars, Shang and Sheng, had been working on immortality elixirs for the emperor. When they failed to produce results, they fled the capital. Before leaving, they reportedly spread criticisms of the emperor among their colleagues, that he was tyrannical, that his methods were excessive, that his obsession with immortality had warped his judgment. When Qin Shi Huang learned of this, he ordered an investigation. The investigation produced accusations against 460 scholars. According to the Shiji, our primary source, written about 100 years later by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, those 460 were executed, reportedly buried alive at Xianyang. The number and method are disputed by modern historians. The event itself is not. Qin Shi Huang's eldest son, the Crown Prince Fusu, had been watching the execution of the Confucian scholarly class with increasing alarm. He came before his father and remonstrated directly that punishing scholars for expressing opinions was too harsh, that it would destabilize the empire, that the scholars were needed. Qin Shi Huang's response was to send Fusu to the northern frontier under house arrest, effectively exiled to serve as an observer to General Meng Tian's wall construction forces. Fusu was by all accounts the most capable of Qin Shi Huang's sons. He was educated, morally serious, and had the standing to command genuine loyalty from the empire's military leadership through his relationship with Meng Tian. He was, in the language of every subsequent Chinese dynasty, right heir for the wrong emperor. He would never reach the throne. In 210 BCE, Qin Shi Huang set out on his fifth and final inspection tour of the empire. He was 49 years old, increasingly unwell, still obsessed with immortality. The tour took him south along the Yangtze, then east toward the sea, then back north through the plains of Hebei. He died at Shaqiu, a staging post in modern Hebei province, in the summer of 210 BCE. The cause, per ancient sources, is unspecified, illness of some kind. He was 700 kilometers from his capital. The two men closest to him at the moment of his death were Zhao Gao, the head of the imperial secretariat and the official who managed all documents passing to and from the emperor, and Lai Si, the chief minister of the empire. Both men recognized immediately that the news of the emperor's death, while the succession was unsecured, while they were far from the capital, while armies and regional commanders had no instructions, could be catastrophic, so they covered it up. For the rest of the journey back to Xianyang, Qin Shi Huang's corpse traveled in the imperial carriage with the curtains drawn. Meals were brought and taken away uneaten. Officials submitted documents and received stamped responses. Cartloads of salted fish were positioned near the carriage, the smell of the fish masking the smell of decomposition as the summer heat did its work. The ruse held for approximately 2 months. Before Qin Shi Huang died, he had dictated a final edict to Zhao Gao, a letter to Fusu, summoning the crown prince home to Xianyang for the succession. The letter was sealed and waiting to be dispatched. Zhao Gao held it. He did not send it. Instead, he went to Lai Si. What Zhao Gao said to Lai Si is recorded in the Shiji with remarkable directness. He made the case that whoever controlled the succession controlled everything. Fusu, as emperor, would rely on his close ally General Meng Tian, who would then displace Lai Si from the chief ministership. Lai Si's position, wealth, and family were all tied to his ministerial rank. Under Fusu, he would lose all of it. Lai Si initially refused. He was, by ancient accounts, a man of genuine legal principle, or at least of principled attachment to the rule of law. What Zhao Gao was proposing was forgery, high treason. Zhao Gao pressed his argument until Lai Si agreed. Together they forged 2 documents. The first was a new succession decree, naming Hu Hai, Qin Shi Huang's 18th son, the emperor's personal student in legal administration, a young man who had spent his life under Zhao Gao's direct tutelage as the new emperor. The second was a condemnation decree addressed to Fusu and to General Meng Tian. It accused them of military failures and disloyalty. It ordered them to commit suicide. The decree reached Fusu and Meng Tian at the northern frontier. Meng Tian immediately suspected something was wrong. The accusation was vague. The timing was strange. He urged Fusu to send a messenger back to Xianyang requesting clarification before complying. The emperor might have changed his mind. He had done so before with other decrees. Fusu refused to wait. His reasoning, or what Sima Qian records as his reasoning, was the reasoning of a man who had been raised in the Confucian tradition of filial submission. The emperor, his father, had commanded. Whatever the command, a son obeyed. Fusu committed suicide. Meng Tian refused and was imprisoned. He was executed later. The man who might have saved the Qin dynasty died because he was too principled to question his father's command, and that command was a lie. Hu Hai was enthroned as the second emperor, Qin Shi, shortly after the convoy returned to Xianyang. He was reportedly 21 years old. His reign lasted 3 years and is one of the strangest in Chinese history. A man who held the most powerful title in the world and exercised almost none of the power it represented. Zhao Gao ran the government. He managed what information reached the emperor. He managed what information left the emperor's court and reached the provinces. He controlled who could see the emperor and who could not, and he systematically eliminated everyone who represented a threat to that control. In the first year of Qin Shi's reign, multiple brothers and sisters of the emperor were executed, forced to commit suicide on charges that Zhao Gao managed and the emperor signed. The Shiji records 12 brothers executed and 10 sisters. The Qin imperial family, which represented the most natural source of political counterweight to Zhao Gao's influence, was methodically destroyed. Lai Si lasted longer than most, but Zhao Gao found a method for him too. Whenever Lai Si tried to remonstrate with Qin Shi about the deteriorating condition of the empire, the peasant rebellions that were beginning in the provinces, the tax collection that was breaking down, the forced labor demands that were producing more resentment than output, Zhao Gao arranged for Lai Si's visits to coincide with moments when the emperor was entertaining himself. Knowing Qin Shi would be irritated at being interrupted, he then told the emperor that Lai Si was deliberately timing his remonstrances to inconvenience him. He told the emperor that Lai Si was conspiring. Lai Si was arrested, tortured into a confession under the 5 punishments: tattooing, cutting off the nose, amputation of the feet, castration, and finally death, and executed in the marketplace at Xianyang in 208 BCE. His entire family was executed with him. The architect of the Qin unification died in the city he had helped build, at the hands of the system he had designed. Before his death, the Shiji records him saying, "I wish to walk the yellow dog out the eastern gate of Shanghai again." He was recalling his hometown, the ordinary life he had traded for power, the small thing he had wanted before ambition consumed everything. It is one of the most human sentences in the ancient record. Meanwhile, in the provinces, something had begun that neither Lai Si nor Zhao Gao had managed to understand. In the summer of 209 BCE, a group of approximately 900 conscripts was being marched from their home districts toward a garrison post called Yueyang, in what is now northern China. They were ordinary men, peasants, minor functionaries, people who had been assigned military duty through the Qin's compulsory conscription system. They were being led by 2 overseers, Chen Sheng, a minor functionary of peasant origin, and Wu Guang, a man of similarly unremarkable background. They reached a place called Daxiang in what is now Anhui province, and the rain came. The flooding made the roads impassable. Day after day the convoy sat and waited. Day after day they fell further behind their scheduled arrival date. Under the Qin legal code, conscripts who failed to arrive at their assigned post on time were sentenced to death. There was no provision for floods, for weather, for circumstances outside anyone's control. The law was the law. Delay was delay. The penalty was death. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang looked at each other and made a calculation that the Shiji records with admirable clarity. Since we face death either way, Chen Sheng said, is it not better to die for a great cause? That reasoning, that when the penalty for failure is death, rebellion is the rational choice, exposes something fundamental about the legalist system. The code was perfectly efficient at eliminating discretion. It was perfectly efficient at ensuring no official could be lenient, no circumstance could be accommodated, no mitigating factor could matter. The same impartiality that made legalism excellent at enforcing compliance made it catastrophic when circumstances produced mass injustice at scale. The flooding at Xianyang was not a conspiracy. It was weather, but the Qin Code treated it as a crime. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang killed their overseers, raised a banner, and addressed the 900 men. Are kings, nobles, generals, and ministers born to their positions? Chen Sheng asked. Or are they men who were placed there by circumstance? The question sounds obvious now. In 209 BCE in China, it was revolutionary. The Zhou dynasty had governed through hereditary aristocracy and ritual obligation for 800 years. The Qin had replaced feudal lords with appointed bureaucrats, but the emperor was still the emperor by blood and heaven's mandate. The idea that anyone could be a king was not part of the political vocabulary of the era. Chen Sheng put it in the vocabulary of the era. To gain legitimacy for the rebellion, he announced that they were fighting in the name of the dead crown Prince Fusu, invoking the memory of the executed heir as the banner of their cause, and in the name of General Xianyang, a famous Chu military hero, whose name could rally the former Chu population in these territories. The rebellion spread with a speed that shocked the empire. Within months, Chen Sheng had captured the city of Chen in modern Henan, proclaimed himself king, and declared the restoration of Chu as the state of Zhang Chu, expanded Chu. Simultaneously, across the former territories of the 6 states, other revolts were exploding. Former nobles, military strongmen, local administrators, and peasants with nothing to lose were all raising forces, often in the name of restoring the kingdoms the Qin had conquered. The old political identities Zhao, Wei, Yan, Kai, Han, Chu had not been erased. They had been suppressed. Now they came back. The Qin administrative machine, designed for conquest, had no mechanism for this. There was no political flexibility, no capacity for accommodation, no tradition of amnesty or negotiation. The code said rebellion was death. The Qin sent armies to impose the code. For a few months, the armies won. Chen Sheng himself was assassinated by his own coachman in early 208 BCE, a victim of the internal divisions that plagued the rebel alliance. Wu Guang had already been killed by his own officers. The Jiangchu state lasted perhaps 6 months. But the 900 men at Xianyang had done something permanent. They had proved the empire could be challenged. They had destroyed the myth that the Qin was invincible, and in destroying that myth, they had triggered something that no army could stop. In the wake of Chen Sheng's rebellion, 2 forces became decisive. In the south, in the area of modern Suzhou, a man named Xianyang had been waiting for this moment. He was a scion of the Chu military aristocracy, the nephew of the same General Xianyang, whose name Chen Sheng had borrowed as a legitimating banner. With him was his nephew, a young man of terrifying physical and military gifts named Xiangyu. Xianyang raised forces. He located a descendant of the Chu royal line, a man named Xingzin who had been living as a shepherd, and installed him as the restored king of Chu. This gave the anti-Qin coalition a legitimating structure, a recognized dynasty, a royal line, a banner that former Chu subjects could follow. In the north, in what is now Jiangsu province, a minor functionary named Liu Bang was in trouble. Liu Bang was a Tingzhang, a village headman responsible for a relay station. He had recently been transporting conscript laborers to the mausoleum construction site at Mount Lai. Some had escaped. Under the Qin Code, he faced the same death penalty as Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, in a gesture that would later be celebrated as benevolent, though the Shiji makes clear it was also rational. He freed the rest of the conscripts rather than face the penalty for their eventual escape. He was already a dead man under Qin law. He might as well use the time. Liu Bang raised a small force in Pei, allied himself with the broader rebellion, and began a military career that no one watching in 208 BCE would have predicted would end with him ruling China. The two men, Xianyang, the military genius from the Chu nobility, and Liu Bang, the dissolute village headman from a minor administrative post, would spend the next several years fighting the Qin and then each other. But in 207 BCE, they were still fighting the same enemy, and the Qin was losing. The Qin's last serious military option was General Zhang Han. He commanded the main Qin relief army, a force that had already suppressed several of the early rebellions, and that remained, by any measure, a formidable military force. If the Qin was going to survive, Zhang Han had to hold the empire together. He couldn't. In 207 BCE, at the town of Julu in what is now Hebei province, Xianyang led the Chu forces across the Xiang River to relieve a coalition army that Zhang Han's forces were besieging. Before crossing, he ordered his soldiers to do three things: sink the boats, smash the cooking equipment, and keep 3 days' rations. Nothing else. There was no way back. The soldiers could win or die. This gesture, described in Chinese as Po Fu Chen Ju, smashing the pots and sinking the boats, became one of the most famous commitment devices in Chinese military history, cited for 2,000 years as the example of a commander who made his army understand that survival and victory were the same thing. It worked. The Qin forces were broken in a series of engagements that left the main army shattered and its commander, Wang Lai, captured. Zhang Han, his supply lines cut and his position untenable, eventually surrendered with his army, reportedly several 100,000 soldiers. The Qin army that had conquered China in 9 years no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. Meanwhile, Liu Bang had been advancing on Xianyang from a different direction, through the southern passes. His smaller force moved faster. He arrived at the Qin capital before Xianyang, and there, in one of the most consequential political decisions of the ancient world, Liu Bang chose restraint. He did not plunder the palace. He did not execute the nobility. He issued an announcement known as the Three-Chapter Agreement: do not kill, do not steal, do not harm. He would await the arrival of the other rebel leaders before determining Qin's fate. He was, he announced, a servant of the people, not their new conqueror. The Qin population, who had experienced 15 years of being the conquered, taxed into exhaustion, conscripted into massive building projects, watched while their scholars were executed, took this restraint seriously. Liu Bang's reputation in the former Qin heartland was, from this moment, fundamentally different from Xianyang's. Xianyang arrived at the Hanggu Pass with an army that reportedly dwarfed Liu Bang's forces. His advisor, Fan Zheng, one of the shrewdest political analysts in the Shiji's account, recognized that Liu Bang's restraint at Xianyang was not generosity. It was a strategy. A man who could resist plundering a palace when he had the opportunity to plunder a palace was a man who was thinking about the future. That kind of thinking made Liu Bang dangerous. Fan Zheng urged Xianyang to invite Liu Bang to a banquet and kill him. The banquet at Hongmen, Swan, Goose Gate was held in early 206 BCE. Liu Bang attended. The sword dance began, performed by Xianyang's cousin Xianyang, who had been instructed to find an opportunity to kill Liu Bang during the performance. Liu Bang's advisor Zhang Liang and his general Fan Qi, who entered the feast uninvited, armed, eating raw pork in front of Xianyang with studied contempt, bought time. Liu Bang excused himself on the pretext of relieving himself. He did not return. Fan Zheng's verdict on what had happened is recorded in the Shiji and has been quoted for 2,000 years. That bumpkin is impossible to work with. Xianyang will be taken by Liu Bang. He smashed a jade ring that Liu Bang had given him as a gift and walked away. He was right. But that is a different story. Xianyang entered Xianyang. He had Ziying, the last ruler of Qin, who had briefly reigned with the downgraded title of king after Zhao Gao killed Qin Shi and been killed himself by Ziying executed. He looted the Qin's accumulated palace treasuries. He distributed the wealth to his troops, and he burned the city. The fire reportedly burned for 3 months. What is certain? The Qin capital was destroyed. The palace complex was gone. The imperial archives, the Qin's own records of their administration, their legal decisions, their version of their history were largely lost. For 2,000 years, historians cited the burning of the Afang Palace as the defining act of Xianyang's destruction. Modern archaeology has revised this. Excavations at the Afang site in 2002 found only a rammed earth foundation platform. No burned walls, no roof tiles, no completed building. The Afang Palace was never finished. What Xianyang burned was probably the Xianyang Palace complex proper, the existing administrative capital, not the monument under construction. The revision doesn't change the outcome. The Qin capital was gone. The dynasty that had conquered China in 9 years and governed it for 15 was over. The formal end came in 206 BCE with Xianyang's execution. The Qin dynasty lasted 15 years as a unified empire. It is tempting, looking at the fish wagons and the forged letters and the deranged loyalty tests, to explain the Qin collapse as a matter of bad luck and bad men. Zhao Gao's conspiracy, Hu Hai's incompetence, Fusu's tragic submission to a forged decree. These things happened, but they happened to a structure that was already failing. The Qin didn't collapse because Zhao Gao was corrupt. It collapsed because a system that produced Zhao Gao had no antibodies against him. The first failure, legalism's post-conquest problem. The legalist state was designed for war-making. It mobilized resources efficiently, enforced discipline, and produced consistent military output. What it had no theory of was how to govern people who didn't need to be mobilized for conquest. The former subjects of Han, Zhao, Chu, and the other states were simply subjected to the same legal code and labor demands as Qin's own population, with no transitional accommodation, no recognition of their previous social structures, no period of reduced demands. The Han Dynasty philosopher Xianyang, writing approximately 15 years after the Qin's fall, articulated this with the precision that comes from watching something collapse from close range. Had the Qin emperor combined benevolent governance with military conquest, the empire would have been preserved. He was identifying not a moral failure but a structural one. The legalist machine had no gear for peace. The second failure, the forced labor burden, the Great Wall, the mausoleum complex with its terracotta army, 700,000 workers by the Shiji's account, the Eping Palace, the road network, the canal construction, all running simultaneously, all drawing from the same pool of conscripted labor, all imposed on a population that had just spent a decade being conquered. The specific mechanism that triggered the Qin Shang rebellion, conscripts facing death for being late due to weather, so revolting because they would die anyway, is not an accident. It is the direct output of a system designed to have no exceptions. The code produced its own undoing. The third failure, the succession eliminating the one competent heir. Fusu was not a perfect ruler in waiting, but he was the only heir with the temperament, the relationships, and the standing to navigate the transition from a conquest state to a governing state. He had opposed the burning of books. He had a working relationship with the Qin military's most capable general. He had the legitimacy that came from being the known heir of a legitimate emperor. His death, caused by his own adherence to a Confucian virtue that legalism had no use for, removed the one person who might have adapted the machine. The fourth failure, the second-generation emperor problem. Qin Shi was 21, inexperienced, and had been selected specifically because he was dependent. The dynasties that followed the Qin would spend enormous effort on succession institutions precisely because the Qin demonstrated what happened without them. Founding emperors are, by selection, exceptional people. Their successors are not. The institution must be stronger than the individual, and the Qin had no institution. The Qin had Qin Shi Huang and then nothing. The fifth failure, the information problem. Zhao Gao's deer as horse loyalty test is recorded in the Shiji as an act of political theater. Zhao Gao presented a deer to court, called it a horse, and then purged everyone who correctly said it was a deer. The point was not that Zhao Gao believed it was a horse. The point was that he wanted a court where no one would say things he didn't want to hear. The legalist state had been designed to make information flow efficiently, and accurately to the emperor. Zhao Gao had converted it into a system that made accurate information dangerous to transmit. By the time the rebellions in the provinces had grown to the scale where they could no longer be ignored, the emperor in Xianyang genuinely did not know the extent of what was happening. When Zhao Gao eventually presented him with the intelligence, the Shiji records that Qin Shi's response was to punish the messenger. The sixth failure: no legitimacy vocabulary. When the peasant rebellions began, the Qin had nothing to say to them. The Zhou dynasty had the mandate of heaven, the Confucian concept that rulers governed because heaven endorsed the moral quality of their governance, and that heaven withdrew that mandate from immoral rulers. When Zhou kings lost legitimacy, there was a shared framework for understanding why, and for how a new legitimate ruler might emerge. The Qin had burned the texts that carried that framework. They had executed the scholars who could articulate it, and they had no equivalent. What the Qin offered instead was law and enforcement, which worked fine until people decided that death was preferable to compliance. Liu Bang won the 4-year Chu-Han contention, defeated Xianyang at the Battle of Gaxia in 202 BCE, and founded the Han dynasty. The first thing Liu Bang's Han dynasty did, and the second, and the third, was not to be the Qin. Taxes were reduced to 1/30th of agricultural yield. The Shiji and Han records are explicit about this. Forced labor conscription was substantially reduced. Amnesty was extended to families that had been punished under Qin. Confucian scholars were invited back to court, their texts recopied from the surviving manuscripts that had escaped the burning, their tradition of moral counsel restored as a mechanism of governance. Jiayi's analysis of the Qin collapse became, within a generation of its writing, a canonical text. Every official who passed through the Han bureaucratic examination studied it. Every subsequent Chinese emperor was expected to understand it. The lesson was not "don't be powerful." It was, "don't confuse the tools of conquest with the tools of governance." Military efficiency and administrative legitimacy are different things. You need both. But here is the paradox that every Chinese dynasty that followed the Qin eventually had to reckon with. While the Qin's governance model was catastrophic, its administrative model was permanent. The commandery county system of direct central administration is still the basic structure of Chinese governance. The principle that officials are appointed rather than hereditary is still the principle. The written script that the Qin standardized in 221 BCE is still, at its root, the script. The Qin Empire lasted 15 years. The Qin administrative revolution has lasted 2,000, and the Terracotta Army, the 8,000 figure burial guard that Qin Shi Huang had constructed to accompany him into eternity, was discovered not by archaeologists but by farmers in Lintong County in 1974, digging a well. They hit pottery fragments. Systematic excavation began the same year. 3 pits have been excavated. A 4th was found empty. Archaeological work is ongoing. The main burial mound, the sealed tomb where the Shiji describes rivers of mercury, and a complete map of the empire rendered in precious metals on the ceiling, has not been opened. The technology to excavate and preserve its contents without irreversible damage does not yet exist. Somewhere beneath that mound, in a chamber sealed for 200 years, is Qin Shi Huang, the man who wanted to reign for 10,000 generations. The fish wagons, the forged letters, the burning city, they are the story above ground. Below, the emperor waits. If you want to understand how the dynasty that replaced the Qin, the Han, who inherited the administrative machine and solved the legitimacy problem, became the longest-lasting empire in Chinese history, and why the dynasty that most Chinese people today still call themselves after eventually fractured into 3 kingdoms in one of the most celebrated civil wars in human history. The next video traces the full arc. The Han dynasty, how 400 years of empire finally came apart.